Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome today. It's a bit of a miserable day, so hopefully this is a good event to host today to keep you engaged and entertained. This morning's session is called How Will Business Change in the New Landscape? And I think everyone we talk to nowadays talks about this being a period of reset and how sustainability will particularly be coming to the fore, as well as the core. Sustainability often gets referred to in terms of environmental sustainability, but actually what we want to broach today is the far broader concept of sustainability, which also includes economic sustainability, cultural and social sustainability. And actually we've been joined today by a whole range of expert and exceptional speakers that really should be to cover this whole range and actually should give us some good information. But we'll be interested in your views as well as we go through this. There is a Q&A button at the bottom, so please do ask any question you wish. Lauren will be managing that, and we will try to get back to everyone with answers either during the session or after this session as well. Our aim is to try to cover new ground today, and sustainability becomes one of those issues that everyone thinks they understand, but actually it's so complex. There's so much more to learn. So we're going to be trying to cover new areas, which again, obviously our speakers will be key to actually helping us on that. So welcome to the range. Just to run through them, we have Ibrahim, the former chief executive of the BHA and now chair of the Hotel Energy Board, and who's recently launched the New Energy and Environmental Alliance. And I'm sure she'll be talking that with Karen as we go. Chris Penn, founder of the Times' Hotel of the Year this year, the Birch. David Reed, chairman of Prestige Purchasing. Mark Davies, managing director of ISS Food Service. Alice Woodwark, managing director of Restaurant Associates. David Walker, commercial director of Winnow, which has won many awards, including one at Davos in 2019 at the World Economic Forum. Ellen Jones, head of sustainability for Prets. Joanna Annan, director of Women in Hospitality, Travel and Leisure. And finally, but not least, Nick Swallow, the New Zealand Trade Commissioner to the UK and Ireland. As I said, our aim is to try and cover new ground and ask new questions to look at trends, beliefs, and how this whole pandemic is changing the belief towards sustainability and also behaviours as well. So welcome, and I look forward to talking to you as we go through this session today. Over to Lauren to ask a few polling questions.
Thank you. Yes, welcome everybody. Lovely to have you here. It's always good for us to see who is in the audience. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to answer this for me, just to let us know what part of the hospitality sector you're most closely involved in, whether it's finance, operations, so development, sales, marketing. Are you an investor, an owner, a bank or lender, or a consultant, or part of the education/student side of things? Thank you for that. Well, it looks like we have majority are advisors, consultants, and legal, so thank you for joining us. Just the next one, if I could ask your time for a moment, is what is your role within your organization? Are you a chairman, a partner, owner, director, C-suite? Are you a GM, department head, supervisor? Are you an operative or other? It's wonderful to see we've been joined by a lot of C-suite partner owners. Thank you for that. And finally, as Chris mentioned, sustainability is something that has definitely moved in recent times to the core of many businesses. I just wondered if you thought that moving forward, sustainability will still be something that businesses actively invest in. Well, that's wonderful to hear, to see. We were a bit worried considering all things, but 97% of you agree that it is definitely something that businesses will continue to actively invest in. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Lauren. It's very good. We can only host these events, obviously, with great partners, and I'm delighted to welcome Karen Freeb from Bird & Bird and James Salford from Bird & Bird, who will be on a bit later. Bird & Bird have worked with us now on a whole range of events over the last couple of years, and it's been a real pleasure to work with them. I'll leave over to Karen now to host the first session. Good luck, Karen.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I'm delighted to introduce to you today Ibrahim, a very good friend of mine over many years, who I'm delighted to say has just launched the Energy and Environment Alliance. So our chat today is really going to focus on that. Ufi, if I could bring you onto the screen, please.
Hello, Karen, good morning.
Can we see you as well? If you could switch your video on.
My video is on.
Yes, we can. We can
see you. Great, I can see you now, thank you. So thank you so much for coming along today to tell us about the newly launched EEA. So perhaps we could start off by you explaining to us what it is and what your key role is at the EEA.
Sure, well, first of all, congratulations on this event. These events are really valuable at this time, so thank you, and thank you very much for having me. And the EEA, which we launched just 2 weeks ago, is a new not-for-profit organization for the industry, where the industry will serve the industry together with scientific experts and leading thinkers in the area of the energy and environmental, social and cultural aspects of business operations. And it's about providing bottom-up pathways and practical solutions to enable businesses to actually become climate positive. So there's a lot of organizations out there who have created high-level strategic top-down declarations, accreditations and other such things for sustainability. But this organization is very much about providing practical solutions to enable that change. So enabling people to actually walk the walk as well as talk the talk.
This is very much the hospitality sector, Ufi, isn't it? So why do hospitality businesses need to change?
Well, the pressure, Chris mentioned it at the start in his opening address, the pressure is mounting. And it's not just public pressure and the pressure from the scientific community or the next generation, those people who are, in many cases, our current and future employees and current and future customers. But governments are responding to that pressure. There's a huge amount of investment in new environmental regulation at the moment. Take the European Union's statement just last week about the fact that they are transforming the European Investment Bank. Parts have already been transformed, in fact, into a European Climate Bank. And then you can look at what's happening in the institutional investment world. In July, Larry Fink, who is the Chief Executive Officer of BlackRock, publicly issued a statement naming the 53 companies that BlackRock, the world's largest institutional investor, took voting action against on climate grounds. And they also named another 191 companies which they have put on public watch. So they're saying that these companies are not providing enough action in terms of performance on ESG, and they are failing to provide the level of public disclosure and transparency required to ensure that they are doing that in an effective way. And just last week, Legal & General did the same for the businesses that they have investments in. So the institutional investment world is moving, in a sense, more rapidly than the regulatory world. And there's a lot of pressure on the hospitality businesses. And final 2 points. I think businesses that are not seen to be doing enough are going to be increasingly targeted. And unfortunately, according to research that was conducted by Ignite Economics, which was launched just 2 weeks ago, the hospitality industry is seen in the United Kingdom currently to be lagging the rest of the economy in terms of energy usage and energy intensity. We rank together with mining, quarrying, and construction in terms of our performance on energy usage and energy intensity, whereas the rest of the UK economy has actually improved the amount of energy, for example, that's used to produce one economic output. Our industry is going in the opposite direction. And even though we're a very small piece of the pie, overall pie in terms of energy usage in the UK, that says a lot about our businesses and what we could be doing. And what we could be doing is saving £270 million worth of energy and cutting 660,000 tons of CO2 emissions just based on small changes which don't really require any upfront capital investment, based on this economist's report, which was also based on UK government data. So that, in a nutshell, I think tells you all of the reasons why change must happen in our industry and why it really needs to start now.
Why do you think the hospitality industry has historically perhaps been so slow to adapt to the need for change and to realise that change is necessary? I mean, I think a lot of people are talking about the Larry Fink statement, the BlackRock statement, because this seems to be a situation now where businesses are going to have to sit up and listen and not just wait for the regulation to come in. But hospitality businesses do you think, seem to have been a little slow on the uptake? Do you think this is going to change now?
It will change, and I hope that the organisation that I'm working with now is going to play a part in being part of that change. And I guess I would say in defence of the industry, looking back over what's happened up to this point in time, the need to change is understood. You know, I believe, and the reason why I love hospitality is because of the individuals that form this fantastic industry, and they're all very passionate about life, and they're all very passionate actually about doing the right thing. You know, serving other people is just part of their DNA, and making sure that the world is a better place is part of their DNA. So I believe that they understand the need to change. Also the businesses, they understand that. But what has been a challenge up to this point in time, I think could be sort of put into five slots. One, there are no industry-wide guidelines which are scientifically robust and uniform, which is what the institutional investors are saying. We want uniformity. That hasn't existed in our industry up to now. Based on the fact that we don't have any industry-wide guidelines as to how to do better, we also have no best practices. There are many case studies out there, but they are not based on this evidence-based, uniform, scientifically robust model. So that is absolutely critical and must be addressed. The other challenge that our businesses have faced up to now is that they haven't been able to benchmark performance. Am I back now?
Yes, you're back.
Yes. So no benchmark, no means to be able to measure. And also there is no single silver bullets in terms of addressing aspects of operations to make you more sustainable. So it's a very complex area, and navigating through this complex area requires collaboration. And that's why we've created the EEA, to address all of these aspects and to create that uniformity, to create those standards, to help to create that benchmarking, to enable the industry to actually make those changes, and to bring together the experts and the suppliers who can actually help them to achieve that, the new technologies. So we are, I guess, inviting that input from that community to say, showcase your new technologies, showcase your new biological technologies as well, not just your technical technologies, but human input, training, education, showcase that. Let's actually find the tools that the industry needs to be able to make that change. It's been very complex up to this point in time to do that. It's difficult for businesses.
And can you share with us at this stage, or is it too early, any specifics as to how you propose to go about measuring members' performance? Have those any benchmarks been formulated yet?
Yeah, so we're working with, in the United Kingdom, we're piloting this for the energy sector, and we're working with all the energy suppliers. And on behalf of our members, we can access all of their energy usage data, and we are doing all of that energy reporting for our members. And we're doing that free of charge for our members at the moment, in order to be able to show them what they're doing, so they can have that understanding as to, okay, where am I? What's my starting point? On a global basis, what we're doing is we're working with BREEAM. Now, BREEAM is one of the world's leading assessment tools for sustainable management of the built environment. what we're doing with BREEAM is we're actually developing the industry standard, the global standard. We're bespoking the current BREEAM schemes specifically for the hospitality industry and hospitality businesses. And similarly, there for members, what we're doing is we are, and this is thanks to BREEAM's generosity, they're enabling our members to actually do the initial self-assessment to get the gap analysis now on a complimentary basis. So at the moment, what we're doing is we're equipping these businesses so that they can understand where they are, they can understand how far they are from the actual standards that they should be getting close to, at the same time as bespoking those standards and taking them further. So that's where we are at the moment, enabling them with that information, equipping them with the knowledge, and putting them in touch with the right people who can actually help them to make the changes on the ground that they need to make.
So how do organisations actually become members of EEA, and how are you getting on so far with attracting members to the organisation? Because I feel, Ufi, that you're a woman in a hurry here, that you really want to drive on with this, and goodness me, we need to get the industry on board with it, don't we?
I'm in a hurry because you know, our industry is, according to government data, the industry which is lagging. I'm in a hurry because I don't think that we should be ranked together with mining and quarrying in terms of our performance in certain areas. I think we can do much better than that. In fact, I'm passionate about the fact that our industry should be leading the sustainability agenda, not lagging. And we have so much that we can contribute in a positive way toward that. And that's why during COVID and the impact that COVID has had on our industry, the EEA has taken the decision to waive any membership fees. So membership is complimentary to industry participants, and all they need to go is go to the website, eea.international, very simple form, sign up, get on board, and help us to enact this change.
We'll contact you after this webinar and ask for further information.
Of course, absolutely.
Because I can imagine
you, Karen, you know, even reaching out to you. Absolutely, yes.
Please do contact me and I can put you in touch with Ufi. And because I can imagine people listening to this thinking, goodness me, it all sounds amazing, but anything like this, I know it's going to be expensive for me. So the membership fees are one thing, but in terms of making these changes that the industry needs to make, I can hear companies saying, well, that's going to cost me, at least in the short term. Is there any sort of reassurance that you can give them on that side of things?
I can give them a lot of reassurance. Not only reassurance, I can actually show them actual performance data with no upfront investment, purely changes in behavioral aspects, which we're helping with the training and education side for their team members. And all of that is also complementary at the moment. We have seen that we have cut energy usage in properties by 7 to 14%. We've seen that with no upfront investment. And then what we have done is through the renewable energy basket that we have created, we are enabling members to switch to net carbon zero energy, so 100% renewable energy, based on robust evidence that that comes from 100% renewable sources. And we're also doing that at prices and rates that the industry couldn't match outside of that basket. So we are actually very mindful of profitability, very mindful of optimizing the bottom line, particularly at this difficult time for the industry. And we are confident that we can actually demonstrate to any business that wishes to engage with us that we can help to optimize costs, optimize that P&L, and actually help to ensure the triple bottom line is performing better. So that's profit, people, and planet. And I always say it's not just the triple bottom line, but it's got to be the triple top line as well. So you know, I'm confident and can demonstrate that to anyone that wishes to look into the data.
And it seems to me, Ufi, that this will have an appeal right across the board for all the different stakeholders in the sector. You know, the big operators, the hotel owners and investors. And have you found that there's been interest from any particular segment of the industry so far?
Well, the accommodation sector has been very interested, particularly in our renewable energy basket and the work that we're doing with BREEAM. And interestingly, the asset owners. So the asset owners and investors they're saying, well, our tenants, those who are the operators of those built environments, do need a lot of help and support. And because they are very keen on optimizing the returns that they get from those assets, they are particularly keen on what we are doing by means of helping the operators to actually deploy the changes to operations that can actually help them to get there. And also because of reputational risk management, and because a lot of those investors are being very watched and their investments are being watched by the investment community, I get a sense of urgency coming mostly from those who are the asset owners. And they're asking us to help them to raise awareness among the operators. So this type of platform is very helpful for us because it gets us to convey that message out to the operators.
Oh, that's fantastic. We've actually got a question coming in from the audience, which would be good to answer if we can. It's quite long, but if I could read it out to you, Ufi. Do you think in time government/world influence could work with hospitality to create some kind of charter and guidance that would make it illegal to use or work with some unsustainable practices as we bounce from one set of standards to another? And I think this is possibly all wrapped up with what's good practice. The other side of the coin is what is bad practice. And it's exactly what you were saying, I think, that BlackRock had taken this point on. Unless you showed good practices, we're not going to invest in you. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that further.
Yes, I think charters are, a charter is a high-level declaration in terms of the way that I define it. But I think what is happening, and Karen, you're very familiar with this yourself, I'm sure, is that the legal community are working very closely with the regulators to actually translate policy around the environment into actual law. So, what I'm seeing is the Chancery Lane project, for example. I have seen that they've done a huge amount of work, and we're engaging with them on creating, well, I'm not going to say streams, but it does seem like that, huge amounts of legal interpretations of incoming regulation on environmental performance and sustainability performance. So I think it's going beyond that now. It's actually going beyond the declarations into actual translation into regulatory, enforceable, enactable laws that businesses will have to comply with going forward. That process is happening now. So I think the underlining the sense of urgency, it's really important for businesses to actually change now, to be leading rather than lagging, because one thing you don't want to be as a business is left in a situation where you are grappling to catch up once these laws are enacted and become standard practice. And the standards are very important as well. There are really two sets of standards globally that are respected by all regulators, by all institutional investors for the built environment. And that is LEED in the United States and BREEAM in the rest of the world, which is why we're working with BREEAM on those standards, because we have to pull everything together to create that global level standard. And we are we've been contacted by LEED to try to ensure that the two, that it really becomes global as well. So I think we've really moved beyond the time when it's all about charters and declarations. Yeah. This is really now translating down into day-to-day operations and the day-to-day perception of everybody who is viewing your business for that transparency, for that disclosure, and for that evidence that you are actually doing the right things in the right ways. And of course, your bottom line as well.
And this will obviously, Ufi, feed through to lenders as well, because we've already had some of our lender clients saying, this topic is of real importance to us. And we're going to be looking increasingly at when we're asked for a proposal to lend to a company, we're not just going to look at what they're doing now. This is going to be something right at the top of our agenda, make sure that it's on their radar and that they're doing something about it. And hopefully that they'll be moving forwards to accreditation, in fact, with the EEA. This is not just something that businesses can ignore anymore.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you, Karen. absolutely.
And just one final question from me, really, Ufi. Do you have plans to engage with the UK government about the EEA? You may be in touch with them already. And is this something that you're going to be bringing to the table with a view to raising the profile through government channels at some stage?
Yes, we will. But, you know, we are not, you know, UK Hospitality is the association for the organization in the UK. So when it comes to lobbying to, I guess, block new regulations coming into the industry, that is very much the association's role. Our role is very different to that. When we work with the UK government, and we are working with the UK government, and we are working with other governments internationally as well, our work is very different. Our work is about focusing on green sovereign bonds, for trying to find green finance mechanisms for the industry. So we're looking at this from an enabling point of view. We're an enabler for that change, which is very different to the role of a traditional association. So for us, this is about equipping the members with the know-how, equipping them with the tools that they need, and equipping them with the finance that they need to be able to make that change. And you're absolutely right, Karen, to bring up the lenders, but governments are also a very big source of those funds. And I mentioned earlier what the EU is doing, but you know, there's a lot more that's happening in the EU. And not only that, I'll give you a stat from the financial markets to tell you about the monies that are available out there for investors who are now looking for sustainable projects to invest in. So earlier this year, in Q1 of 2020, where COVID was already rampant around the world and much of Europe was already changing, nevertheless, there was a net outflow of wider funds in the European markets of about 148 billion euros. Whereas there was a net inflow of ESG funds in the same period to the tune of 30 billion euros. And the total of ESG related funds now in those financial markets in Europe is in excess of 600 billion euros. And it's growing rapidly. So there is a significant shift in the financial markets and investment community. And I think even more than regulation, that must be a very important alarm for businesses to understand that for accessing capital, for longevity of profitability, to manage and mitigate any reputational risk, and ultimately it's the right thing to do. This must be a major investment area and opportunity for businesses right now.
Ufi, well, thank you very much. And I'm sure everyone can see that you are already bringing your customary dynamism and commitment to this role. So we'll all be expecting great things. But please do, if you need to know more, Ufi's got some great data that she shared with me that I'm sure she'd be very happy to share with you as well. So please do get in touch with me or with Chris if you would like some more information about the EEA or how you can join. But thank you very much, Ufi, and good luck with this. And I will now pass back to Lauren.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you very much, Ufi. It's my pleasure to introduce James, and there he is, to host the next session, which is all on environmental sustainability with David Reed and Ellen Jones and David Walker. So James, over to you.
Thanks, Lauren, and good morning, everybody. Ufi has very eloquently put the case for us as an industry to do more to protect the environment and develop our sustainability credentials. I'm very glad today to say I'm joined on our panel, which is going to focus on environmental sustainability, by 3 people who have made a career out of protecting the environment and driving the change in sustainability. David Reed, who is chair of Prestige Purchasing, a supply chain consultant who works with the hospitality and F&B industry to look at where improvements can be made. Ellen Jones, who is head of sustainability at Pret a Manger, and David Walker, who is the chief commercial officer at Winnow, who are a food waste business who look at how AI can help improve reductions in food waste. David, if I could read, sorry, I should say, if I can start with you, and we talked yesterday, the impact humans have had on the environment is truly terrifying. I think, put a stat out there, extinction of animals is now 100 times more likely and faster than it happened at a natural rate. Clearly, the impact that the food and beverage industry and the hospitality industry has in terms of its demand on the food supply chain has been a key part of that. And I know you look very closely at the impact that demand we place on the food and farming industry has on the industry. I'm grateful for your thoughts as to how do you see that impact happening? What do you think we can do to improve the impact we are having?
Thanks very much, James. Good morning, everyone. I think the first thing I would say is that, you know, the pandemic has distracted quite a lot of people, because I think sometimes people struggle to have more than one crisis in their lives. And we definitely have two existential crises going on, which actually, in my view, are interconnected. And I think sustainability may have not been so front and center for certainly the last 6 months. And I think if you look around at what is going on in the world right now, all of the major problems we face are all kind of linked. You know, climate change, soil degradation, the pandemic itself, I think are all linked to one thing, which is our relationship with nature. And I think where that all starts with, for me, is around the scale of population. There are 7.8 billion people on the planet today. When I was born, and you can see I'm fairly mature, but when I was born, there was 2.5 billion on the planet. So we've grown 3 times in my lifetime, which is over 3 times the number of mouths to feed. And in my lifetime, food and farming has changed from being an intrinsically local activity to being a global industry, and it's become industrialized. Half of our fertile land on the planet is now farmed. And 70% of the birds on the planet are domestic, and most of those are chickens. And actually, if you look at the balance between animals on the planet now, 70% of the animals on the planet are actually 70% of the beings on this planet are animals, and we actually eat most of them. The wild animal population in terms of including humans, the wild animal population on the planet is now 4% of all beings on the planet. So we have removed 90% of the large fish from the sea since 1950. And the conclusion that I think one has to make from all of that is that essentially our diet of animal protein, which is what essentially we eat the most of, is actually no longer sustainable. We can't, you know, we're going to run out of enough animal protein if our population continues to grow in the same way as it is now, and it's likely to peak by the end of this century, but there's still some way to go before then. If I can just add to that, it's particularly damaging is deforestation. Over half of land species on the planet live in tropical forests. And there's a double whammy, of course, that when you chop a forest down, it takes away the timber, but then uses that land for farming. And in particular, palm oil has been a massive driver of deforestation. We've cut down 3 trillion trees since 1950. Last year alone, we cut down 10 million trees in tropical forests, and half of our rainforest is gone on the planet, and it's still disappearing at a fast rate. And all of these things are really driven predominantly from our food system. So, you know, for me, I think there are some really important things we need to think about, in particular, around encouraging consumption of less meat, and also making sure that the food and drink that we do create is sustainable, not depleting the planet's resources. So that would be my kind of introduction thoughts.
Thanks, David. And I think it's something we talked about yesterday when we had our prep call on this. Ellen, if I can come to you, I mean, you're sort of very much at the coalface, being at a major food retailer, and obviously COVID has impacted a lot of businesses, including yours. Are you finding that the drive to sustainability is being challenged by the challenge that COVID presented, or is it still front and foremost in terms of what you're trying to achieve as a business?
I think it has to be first and foremost in terms of what we're trying to achieve by business. I think for anyone on the call, we all know how tough it has been, and COVID did cause a pause of, well, how do we react to shops closing? How do we run out stock? So things that we thought we had planned were absolutely changed by that, but it also has given a lot of opportunity to understand the importance of our supply chains. I think when COVID hit, everyone all of a sudden could see there was more transparency about, oh, where does our food come from? Why are there shortages? How are we so fragile in terms of our existence? And that comes from, being a parent at home trying to get loo roll, all the way down to being in shops and looking at our supply chains. And I think that really connected, as I said, environment and people in a way that people previously said, you're just disconnected from how you buy food and where it comes from. And that for me was a real zeitgeist moment, not only as a person, but also I think for us as a society. And that builds stronger business cases for sustainability, as well as has really galvanized it to the forefront of what we need to do.
And do you think now is an opportunity to really reset how we do a number of things? Clearly, a lot of businesses are going to have to rethink how they do things, are going to have to evolve. And is now sustainability a key driver in how we evolve out of the COVID crisis?
I think when you look at how you would change a business that's in full flight versus how you would change a business that's starting from a standing stop, gives you very different opportunities. And you can make bigger steps that previously would have caused a supply chain disruption, would have caused a lot of retraining that you didn't have time to do. And that pause from COVID has given more time to think about, well, how would we do this if we were starting from scratch? Because frankly, a lot of things are restarting from scratch. And then secondly, how would we do this if we were collaborating with others? So having that moment to think, as opposed to, the high street is incredibly competitive. It's, when people talk about, well, why is it hard to change? I think that competitive, we have to stay on top of things and move, sometimes can blind you from the bigger picture. And, this idea of pausing, speaking to others, saying, well, how would we build this if we were starting from a stop, all gives opportunities to build better business cases and make bigger changes than you would if you were in full flight. I'm saying, okay, well, we can't disrupt, the margin from today. The margin from this year is blown. So let's think how we can build better.
Yeah, and we talked yesterday about collaboration. Perhaps you'd expand on that a little bit more. I think that's quite an important theme in terms of how we take them forward. And David, perhaps I'll pull you in as well afterwards.
Yes, so collaboration amongst the industry has really been, in my mind, kicking off over the past 2 years. And it really is critical for us to actually make coherent asks of our supply chain so that we can actually change the system, because sustainability won't be won by any single competitor. And, as we were talking in the first session about, confusing requests, how do we get data? What is meaningful? Collaboration can really help that. And there have been a couple of initiatives over the past couple of years, one of which will tee up David Walker quite well. The first is the Plastic Pact, which is really about getting the industry behind 4 goals. But how do we reduce our plastic consumption? How do we ensure it's more recycled? And that put together the entire value chain and making sure that we're working for the same items, whether it's recycled content, how do you eliminate usage, how do you increase the recycling rate? And the fourth, which I should know off the top of my head, I will remember it and cut back in at an inappropriate time to tell you. The next one, wraps food waste commitment how do we enable us to measure our food waste, learn from best practice, as we were talking about, make that triple win of savings, feeding more people, reducing pressure on climate. And then also my other two that I wanted to mention were on recycling. So how do you recycle coffee cups, the National Cup Scheme? That's all the high street working together. And then linking back into people, there's another collaboration called the Business for Inclusive Growth, which is how do we take best practice for human rights and ensure that's similar across our supply chain. So really creating these pre-competitive spaces that NGOs and compliance bodies can enable brands to come together in order to make a difference in coherent, similar requests through our supply chain, can really, has just really enabled us to do things faster and in a more reasonable way, as opposed to saying, oh, how do we touch something here? How do we touch something there? This is how do we make a big change across all of our brands?
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think I read earlier you've recycled something like 155 million coffee cups, which is a staggering statistic, but just goes to show what can be done if organisations work together. David Walker, perhaps I bring you in. Obviously, one of the areas where, as an industry, we're horrendously wasteful, and I think I read we waste something like £3.2 billion a year of food, or something did it as of 2018, which is frankly a terrifying number. I know this is an area you're very keen to sort of work in and look at how we improve our environmental footprint. Perhaps you can tell me a little bit more about what is it your organisation's done, and how do you think what's the impact of food waste, and how do we go about trying to reduce it?
Sure, James. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's been quite a year so far. What we found over the last 6 months or so, once the pandemic hit, we realised that businesses were going through a period of having to reevaluate a whole series of aspects around their organisation, their operations, their supply chains, their clients, the fact that outlets were shut. I must have spent around about 100 hours over the course of the pandemic speaking to clients all over the world from all different sectors, from cruise ships to catering to hospitality to casinos. So all of these businesses were being significantly disrupted, and we were very keen to work out where food waste lived in terms of their strategy, in terms of their ongoing sustainability approach. What we found was in the very short term, and I think this echoes some of the points already made, in the very short term, there has been a blip, there has been a acceptance. This is both from a consumer and a corporate viewpoint as to we need to make things safe and secure. And this points to an increase actually in single-use plastics. One of the unintended consequences of the growth of home delivery has been the increase of plastic containers being used for that purpose. So in the very short term, as businesses have reorientated, reimagined themselves, there has been a short-term impact on the environment. And I think we all understand that. Safety and security has become the #1 priority. And as businesses are being reimagined, that still remains the #1 priority. The level of uncertainty, if you think back to March when plans were being made, we kind of looked forward to June and thought things will be better in June. We got to June, we then thought, well, it'll be September after the summer. And here we are in October, with the amount of uncertainty, if anything, increased from where it was earlier on during the pandemic. So I guess what the big shift for me in the last 4 weeks or so has been this sense of we are where we are, and the idea of returning to normal or there being a new normal seems to be a redundant concept, and in its place becomes this feeling of degrees of stability. And as businesses continue to think about the future, I very much hope and expect that sustainability will come more into the fore, and that was borne out in the conversations that I had over the summer. So I think that in the short term, whilst sustainability has taken a hit, and the consequence of that, of course, is that as volumes have decreased and costs have increased, margins have been squeezed. So sustainability has understandably taken something of a backseat. But without exception, every business I spoke to talked about the rebuild being green, and talked about 2021 being the year when sustainability would become at the core of strategy. And I think, to echo David's point from earlier on, I can't think of a more important role that we all have to do. This is our once in a generation opportunity to rebuild in a way that is more sustainable. It's been forced upon us. Maybe we needed the pandemic to focus our minds on the environment in which we live in. And to take Ufi's point around how businesses are going to be thinking about this idea of those 3 Ps. And I think in terms of profit, planet, and I think you mentioned people, I'm going to talk about productivity. And as organizations reimagine themselves going forward, they're going to be looking at their business through those 3 lenses. And I think we have every opportunity to ensure that that rebuild will be green.
Thanks, David. A question then to the panel, and David, we'll start with you and go through everybody. I think everyone accepts it's such a big issue. It's too big for any one organisation, any one person, or any one government to do. But how do you think we get the balance right between government legislation, government incentives, corporate responsibility, and personal responsibility? What do we think the balance is? David, perhaps you can kick off. Read, that is.
I think let's start with government, because I think government is probably the most important in terms of creating the frameworks for change. And I think that for me there are 5 things which, if we could achieve through our governments, would actually turn the tide back into a more biodiverse and more sustainable world. And those 5 things, first of all, are food standards. And we are headed in precisely the wrong direction, although the House of Lords, I noticed, kicked the agricultural bill back into the House of Commons last night, saying that the government's clause about not having to stick to its promise about maintaining food standards on trade deals has now been kicked back into the House of Commons. So that is good news. But for governments, and our government particularly, we need to lobby really hard to ensure that we're not running a increasingly sustainable farming system in the UK and then importing unsustainable practices from overseas. The second one for me is green energy. We have the potential to power a vast proportion of the energy that we use, both in transport and also in our sites, through using renewable sources. And the government needs to intervene and create the right framework to make that really accelerate. We need to stop burning fossil fuels now. We need to get into that place. The third thing is rewilding policies. Every time we eat a steak, we create demand for land. And actually the whole of our country and many other nations of the world, we are depleting wild land and destroying biodiversity, and we need to change that. The fourth is we need to stop deforestation now. And I think that is a government role, particularly around food standards, related to unsustainable practices from many of the tropical countries. And lastly, I think no fish zones are really, really important. There's been a number of trial projects around the world where by just creating zones where there is no fishing has actually so dramatically increased fish stocks that even areas which are not no fish zones have seen increases in fish stocks. And I think those are big roles for government, whereas corporate is really about trying to exploit those frameworks that the government then puts in place. And we really need, in my view, we need the government to stand up for that. And then for individually, what I would urge everybody to do, don't just sit on your hands, join WWF or join Greenpeace or join some other political organization and actively become involved in pushing government. That would certainly be my view.
Thanks, Dave. And Ellen, your thoughts?
Yes, just taking some good notes, because it's always good to have a step-by-step guide for how we can sort this out. I think when I hear about the government role and food standards and deforestation, that we're all aligned, but we all have different roles to play, and how we feed in how we can best do it, because no single actor will have all the answers. And a really good example about how we can collaborate and really just, we have to build these relationships, is the Deforestation Consultation. The WWF reached out to industry to say, this is incredibly important, but not only do you need to get behind it, but there are changes which we recommend and can speak to you about. So for instance, the Deforestation Consultation went forward, and it was going to be based, well, it is currently in consultation to be based on turnover. But that's a real loophole, because basically what will happen is actors will create smaller, David's smiling, I don't know, I'm hoping you agree with me, David.
I totally agree with you.
Smaller organizations that will buy a lot of rubber, and they'll do it through lots of small companies. And that's a huge loophole. And then you'll have larger companies who will be reporting but not making a difference. And so that real collaboration of, you know, the WWF getting it into the agenda, then going back to industry and saying, hey, this matters, and this is how you can help. And then that gives us a role to go back to government and say, we absolutely support this, but it needs to be done in a way that doesn't have the consequence, the opposite consequence of people misusing the system. So I think these feedback loops of communication and understanding the roles that we all have to play are absolutely critical, and hopefully we'll start to get this bigger change going. And then the other group, which we haven't talked about, is actually ourselves and the role that we have as individuals. And as a brand, and retailers, we have a huge pool of people who we can speak to. We have our teams who we can train, and we have our customers who we can offer, you know, more plant-based items to, and how you make that something that's the norm that you want to have, or how, you know, in our organization, whenever I present on, this is a topic that's important to Prets as a brand, and this is what we can do to support our organization to meet our sustainability aims. There's always a section on, and this is how you can take these changes home. This is how you can reduce food waste in your house. This is how you can save electricity, so that it just becomes integrated. It's not something we do at work, it's something we do at home, and really building those networks and sharing information is critical.
Great, thanks. And David?
Thanks. Alan, I agree. There's something here about behaviour, and I think if you think about change in behaviour, which is what we're talking about here, fundamentally, we've got the change of behaviour at an individual level and then at a corporate level. And I think government around the world are implementing different strategies, and there's a couple of interesting ones that we've experienced recently. In China, there's the Clean Plate campaign, and there was one very interesting angle on this, which again, I'm not sure how replicable this is around the world, but one of the aspects of that policy is there's some universities and schools that are now excluding scholarship opportunities if daily leftovers in the dining room exceed a stated amount. And this is direct intervention, right, to try and change the behavior of individuals, to put in place either an incentive or a disincentive. But that's a huge project that's going on in China at the moment. They're wasting something like 18 million tons of food. So they've made a statement. In Singapore, there's a really interesting project that we're involved with at the moment, and they are wanting to get 10,000 businesses involved in a 4-month program to measure and assess food waste. And I think the first element of progress is to create this understanding of baseline as to where we are now. And I think we're going to see businesses do more of that. And it depends on the political environment. It depends on the culture of the country or the business framework as to whether it's going to be incentive or disincentive. But we've been very, very enthused by some of those strategies that we've seen implemented, albeit a little way away from the UK at the moment. We saw the announcement last week from Ben Elliott in the UK. So I hope and expect that there will be a greater focus. My personal view here, as you would imagine, is that food waste is the best kept secret in the environmental world. It's its carbon impact is 3 times greater than plastic. It contributes to around about 10% of global carbon emissions. And in a world where we have millions going hungry every day, the fact that 1/3 of the food is wasted is still a horrendous statistic that we should never get comfortable with, and it should never fail to shock. I think there's a huge opportunity for that to be translated into the consumer mindset. I don't think it's there yet. It's certainly not there around the world. It's certainly on a market by market basis. But I think what we'll see is government developing policy as we come out of COVID, but there'll be a mixture between incentives and disincentives. And I think we'll see that apply to both consumers and to corporates as well.
James, would you mind if I just added one point as well here on this subject, which is if you want a lockdown watch at the moment, pretty much everybody, I think, probably on this conference is interested in sustainability. Watch the most recent David Attenborough documentary, A Life on Our Planet, on Netflix. And if you can, share it with as many people as you can, perhaps even all your staff, because it is probably one of the most moving sustainable documentaries I've seen in years. And I think it's a fantastic tool, and we should be using it to motivate people to get behind sustainability really strongly as we emerge from the pandemic.
Thanks, David. A question just come in actually saying, how much difference do we think rewilding the UK will make? Is it about soil health, and is meat consumption really the problem? David, maybe you can sort of give your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you have to look at this as a global issue. The first thing I'd say is, but the UK has a part to play, and I think you are right. It is about creating the situation where we have more land, because rewilding will make a difference, and we can do that perhaps not just by eating less meat, which I think is something we absolutely should do, but I think some of the fantastic innovations that are going on in agriculture right now, particularly using vertical farming, using hydroponics. You know, the Netherlands, for example, has completely revolutionized its fruit and vegetable production. It's now the largest fruit and vegetable producer in Europe, and a very large proportion of what they're producing now is produced hydroponically with incredibly high yields, and very, very high sustainability standards. So I do think it is a mixed bag of things, but we have to rewild in the UK. We are in a really, really dangerous situation from the point of view of biodiversity here, and our soils are, well, they're now recovering because farming methods have improved, but they're still a long way away from where they should be.
Thanks, David. I'm conscious of the time, so I have one last question for everyone, which we've got the participants on the call today are a mixture, largely senior people, hopefully from companies. I suspect a number of them are sitting there going, great, this is fantastic, want to buy into it, but we don't currently do much. Where do I start? If you sort of had one piece of advice for anyone on the call about how do you go about making that change? And maybe Ellen, we can start with you.
It's just racking my mind as the right answer. I would start by reaching out to companies that you think are doing a good job. People who work in sustainability love to talk about sustainability and share, and you might find a peer organization is doing a better job, or they might have a link to set you on the right path. Everyone's, carbon footprints, everyone's levers are different depending on what your business is. And so I would first reach out to, either a peer who you admire, who's doing it well, or you think is doing it well, or even to your industry bodies. They might have good links to get started. But I think the first thing is, if leadership is bought in, then you can make a change. It needs to come from the top to get the change across your organization. Thanks,
Ellen. David Walker, do you want to give us your thoughts?
Yeah, I would suggest that organizations know where they're starting from. So there's a big amount of organizations are making external stated goals about environmental impacts, whether it's reduction of food waste, whether it's 100% renewables, whether it's reducing their overall waste, zero to landfill. Many organizations don't actually know what the starting point is. And I think a lot of businesses are aligning against the SDG of halving food waste by 2030. My advice is, as soon as you start to measure, you will start to improve. And therefore the first stage is to get to a starting point, know where you are, because without that, it'll be very, very hard to track progress. When you do start to progress, it will energize the organization. It'll give you things to talk about. It will accelerate your improvement. So know where you are.
Thanks, David. And finally, David.
Well, I would say this as chairman of a supply chain consultancy, but I would walk straight to whoever's in charge of your supply chain and demand to see the operating standards that they're working to in terms of sustainability. And if you want an easy benchmark, go and look at Marks and Spencer's framework. It's excellent. It's not totally applicable to our sector, but it's pretty close, and it's a great starting point.
Thanks, everyone. David, and in fact, David, thank you so much for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed that. I think I've certainly found it fascinating. I think it's incumbent on all of us to take away what we've talked about in the last half hour, think about it and think what changes you can make, however small, to make an improvement. So I think we all know this is a critical issue. With that note, thanks very much, and I'll pass back to Lauren.
Thanks, James.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, James. Thank you, everyone. That was really, really interesting. And David Reed, as ever, very sobering and quite scary. If I could ask Chris to come, he is chairing the next session, which is all about workplaces, with Mark Davies and Chris Penn. I'll hand over to Chris.
Thank you, Lauren. That's very kind. It's more about consumer behaviours, because I think that's one of the parts about this. We talk about sustainability and what has to happen a lot, but actually how behaviour is really changing. And I think that's what I'm really interested to explore with Mark and Chris. Chris has been well known in the hotel sector now for a whole number of years, and this year founded the Birch up in Hertfordshire. And the Birch is a very different type of operation, so I'll be very interested to see what you are finding in terms of people coming to visit you and what experience you have. Mark is Managing Director of ISS Food Service, which covers all kinds of operations right across the spectrum, from schools, and I'd be interested to see how schools are reacting to this time, to the B&I sector and what's happening in that, to healthcare, right across it. So welcome to both of you. Chris, let's just start with you, because obviously you've launched a hotel this year, and I can't call it the Birch this year. And it is a very different type of operation. What are you seeing with customers coming to stay with you? Are you seeing a slight change in behaviours?
It's difficult, Chris, because we launched the business off the back of lockdown. So we had a perspective of how we thought consumers' needs and expectations were changing with respect to experience in hospitality, which was why we created Birch. So we felt that people were, particularly those that lived in cities, shackled by this idea of stress, deadline, city life, constantly needing to be on. And so we created Birch with an idea of actually people wanted to re-engage with nature, re-engage with friends, family, society, and to escape the kind of restrictive constraints that exist in their normal lives. So that's kind of what Birch was created for. Birch was due to open in April, but was forced to shut before it opened, and all of the challenges that represents. But it's therefore hard to see how our consumers have changed, because we didn't have consumers before coronavirus. But what we have seen is, I guess, an exacerbation of the kind of roots of what we put together in terms of a promise to consumers about giving them wellness, balance with nature, balance with food, balance with the arts in a very immersive, experiential way. And I guess we're very lucky that I think lockdown has forced people to rethink why in their life, and has forced them to rethink family, locality, community, conscience, And therefore, if anything, I would say the change has been that it's grown the consumer base for something like Birch, because more people are wanting to reconnect and to escape the shackles of what the life was that we were leading, or many people were leaving, particularly in city environments pre-COVID. The other change that I would say I've definitely seen is a growth in expectation. So we're very, very specific about who we're trying to attract and then what we're trying to deliver to them. So there's a big consumer focus. But I think one thing that's been really interesting is as operators have been forced to cut costs and to change the way that they work in order to make it safe, the expectations of consumers have if anything, got heightened because their disposable income levels are lower. Where they spend their money, they're more discerning about, and therefore there's no kind of there's an acceptance that things would be different, but there is no acceptance for a reduction in quality of service, quality of produce, provenance of produce, and an all-round experience. And that's the challenge at the moment, I think, for every operator, is balancing the need to stay alive and survive through still being able to generate cash, but also be able to be safe, be open, and deliver on consumer expectations.
Very fair. Mark, how about from your side? Are you seeing similar trends?
Yeah. Well, hi everyone. Well, I'd certainly agree with Chris about that growth in expectations and the need to make sure that you're delivering something that's an outstanding experience in a very, very different environment. I assess food services are a B2B to C organisation. So we work with organisations up and down the country, as you mentioned, in schools and in hospitals and in workplaces in various different sectors. And then we also have consumers that we serve within those environments. And as Chris mentioned, a lot of those environments have been closed through lockdown, and certainly from a workplace point of view, the second wave has really put paid to what we thought was a new dawn, as I think David Walker mentioned back in September, and that's delayed that. So we're plunged back into crisis mode, if you like, but a flip-flopping between trying to manage that, almost in survival mode in terms of making sure we're going to get through this second wave, but making sure that we've got this build back better mentality and thinking about the future. In terms of changing behaviour, I think fundamentally, let's just put schools and hospitals to one side. I think fundamentally the biggest change for us in a particular lot of our customers is that change in the workplace. And so before we think about our food services within the working environment, we have to think that the working environment is going to fundamentally shift. And so I think that's the place that we're starting from as ISS, is saying, actually, okay, what is going to be different? We are going to find that consumers will be coming into the workplace or into the office, not necessarily to work, but to do other things. The office will become a destination and not necessarily a daily commute. And there will be different reasons to go to that destination than what they had before. So that's a fundamental shift. So we see that the workplace will be a place to meet with other people, very social, interactive environment, much more collaborative, a reason to meet, almost that plug-in to corporate culture. If you're spending some time away from your workplace for any period of time. And therefore the food services that we perform will be different. And we see a much greater shift towards things like social cafes or even work cafes. A bit like, the hotel lobby of the past will actually be something that you'll see, or the business lounge will be something you'll see actually in workplaces. And we see that therefore that the services that we provide will be different. It'll be all day grazing, not necessarily the standard times that we've seen in the past. So we're working really hard, whilst an awful lot of our customer sites remain closed because of the work from home guidance, to really try and imagine what that might be and how do we make sure that we are relevant in the new workplace of the future, whilst we're still busy operating operating in our schools and our hospitals.
I mean, look, you touched on a whole range of issues there, but it's fascinating because actually if work patterns change, it's going to change both how people go to venues like the Birch, and we'll talk about the Birch community in a second, Chris, because again, a lot of that's about bringing work and leisure together, isn't it? Correct me if I'm wrong, but also cities are going to change quite dramatically as a result as well. And that long term could be quite good, but it's going to be quite a rough ride, isn't it? Short term.
Well, people are going to be commuting less, and I think people will want to commute less, which naturally will mean there'll be less activity in cities. So the city reinvention is going to be something that we'll all keep a really close eye on as to how that plays out. And I generally think that could be a good thing for society. But we have to wait and see how that plays out. I mean, certainly initially we're seeing certainly our customers in the public sector really think more of what they call social value, about what organisations can bring, not in terms of the direct service provision, but the things that the organisation can do to support the local community, to support the environment, to support the people who are engaged as stakeholders within their organisations, so much more than they've ever done. And certainly, as we've heard already today, ESG as a topic is really coming into the main foreground, and we as organisations are being measured on how we're getting on. An example being the Food Foundation have launched a measurement system called Plating Up Progress, and all of the big organisations involved in food and hospitality and high street are being measured, and those measurements are being shared with the investor community. So you're seeing the shift already, even though we've still got this second wave that we're dealing with.
Chris, your thoughts on this? Because actually, in some ways, if people are commuting less, they're going to come and spend more time at operations like yourself and mix leisure and business much more, aren't they?
Yeah, I think it's definitely blended. I think it was in many businesses, and particularly in the creative industries and in the more entrepreneurial side of industry, I think it had already started to blend. I think what it has forced is more traditional companies that were maybe fearful of not being able to see their workers in physical environments every single day. I think it's encouraged them. Well, they've kind of had to, right, initially in lockdown, but it's forced them into this situation where they've had to trust and they've had to set up infrastructure to be able to allow people to work remotely. And I think it's been really surprising, actually, even when they said people could go back to the office, how few people went to the offices. And the death of the city has really surprised me. In hotels as a sector, it's always been that cities win and regions struggle. And we're very lucky we've created a proposition that's not a city-based proposition. It's about kind of being outside of cities, but well located to them. So we're in a very lucky place to be able to pick up people that have tried to work from home and have been forced to work from home, and then have realized that actually working from home is probably a negative blend of life and work, because it starts to have an impact on your emotional and mental health, because you get straight out of your bed to your desk, you sleep where you work, you don't get outside. And I think there's so a friend of mine, I won't name the company, but who's in a big company, an insurance firm, has suggested that they're quite worried about a large proportion of their workforce that are now so used to working from home, they are anxious about going to an office, and they're anxious about even doing simple things like putting a shirt on or going outside, because they've really then embraced working from home, but to the point where they've become almost isolated and secluded in their own homes. So I think where Birch is interesting, and it was never our intention to create kind of a workplace, it was to create an environment for a lifestyle that would bring together wellness, nature, food, arts, and then could also be a place where you could live and work. But work has become a big reason why people are engaging with it, because working from local is far more desirable than working from a commutable location in a city which is deemed to be unsafe. So I think work from home has changed people's mind, changed big businesses' mind, but I think there is a big issue or a potential issue coming up with that emotional and mental health challenge of people being isolated.
Yeah, look, and Mark, you must be seeing that particularly in education, aren't you? It's anxiety piece.
Oh, very much so. I mean, obviously the relationship that society has had with food has fundamentally changed since lockdown, and I think was mentioned earlier, that started with just getting access to food from within your supermarkets, and we reached out much more locally to get our food. And then what's came more and more into the spotlight is malnutrition and obesity, but particularly focused on the young, and obviously the Marcus Rashford campaign more latterly about just making sure that those that are struggling are fed well, and schools have a big part to play in that. And whilst our schools are obviously really working hard, managing the second wave, trying to get children back stably into education consistently and regularly, there is a growing desire to make sure that good food is available to as many children as possible. Not just through term time, but obviously this is growing clamour to make sure that good food is available outside of term time as well. And that means that as a food service provider, we feel the responsibility for that, to make sure that the service that we provide has real meaning to it, is full of purpose, and that is something that I've certainly seen within my team, that however hard it is to remobilise all of our schools in a COVID safe way, getting children eating hot food, that they have been amazing in making the extra effort to do that in all the different ways we have to now do it, because there's real meaning to it. And I think that trend won't go away, that I think that this level of importance about how do we make sure we're closing the gap amongst the young, how do we support their food intake and their relationship with food early enough so that continues into the rest of their lives. So it's an interesting time for those working in school food and more broadly with the young and considering young people's health.
Chris, what surprised you most since opening in terms of behaviours?
Well, a nice surprise was that people came, but that's a different story.
It helps.
As a new business, when you open your doors with a base of 0, it's fantastic to find that people do engage with you and embrace what you're trying to achieve. I think we ramped up a lot quicker. Speaking personally, we ramped up a lot quicker than we had ever imagined that we would, partly because I think we are locationally in a place that is desirable in terms of connection to city, but not in city. And we've also then created an infrastructure that's desirable because it has a lot of space and it has quality aspects across those verticals that I mentioned before. So I think that was a nice surprise, and a negative surprise, which is not specific to our consumers necessarily, but it's a more political and societal thing, is I think it was a really pleasant surprise to me how people kind of became more humanized through lockdown. And I think, we've enjoyed the rehumanization of society kind of post-lockdown because we are a very human business and brand. And so when we built what Birch was, we wanted to have a direct emotional relationship with consumers. And I think that's been really helpful for us, where consumers that have become rehumanized have kind of really appreciated decisions that they make, and making not so much commoditized decisions around cost and location necessarily, but they've made decisions around ethos and purpose and soul and people and those things, which I think is really, really good. The negative surprise is how some people very quickly lost that when lockdown went, and then just immediately went back to prior behaviors of greed and You know, massive cost cutting, massive redundancies, and many businesses were forced into that. Absolutely appreciate that, but I was, yeah, I guess negatively surprised at how society became very distanced again for many people.
No, I think
so.
Mark, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, yeah, it was a big surprise how quickly people started working from home and got used to it. I think we went through waves of thinking that things would get back to normal through the spring into the summer, and now we're into the autumn, and now we're thinking actually it's never going to get back to the same. And I think I agree. I think that this focus on survival now is much more prevalent out in society today than it was back in March and April, and that I think is a forced switch of behaviour on many organisations and individuals, given that the number of job losses that are being caused at the moment. I think, but just generally, I've been pleased with the way that society has become more human. Certainly, our customer group, particularly in the private sector, have really engaged with us on a much more social conscious level, where they were much more hard-nosed and actually much more considerate towards us as a supplier, and we're more considerate towards our supply chain as well than we probably ever were. And in fact, the private sector has been more considerate and conciliatory than the public sector, whose behaviours haven't changed that much during lockdown. And certainly the other surprise for me is the collegiate sense of the community that we are as food services, and how we've come together as operators. And typically, you know, we would fundamentally compete with each other, and now we found it very natural, I think, to collaborate and cooperate, so that we are all in a better place and we all help each other to survive. And I think that's been a nice surprise.
But touching on Chris's point, and this is going to be the key to this piece of the discussion, isn't it, is what people want to do is see greater compassion back in how we all work, go to care, which is what you're touching on as well, and actually see probably greater bond between local suppliers and operators. Probably that's going to grow in pressure. Is that something we can expect to see, or will it all go out the window the moment we do come out, do you think?
It's difficult to say. It would be hard. I mean, certainly for I'm sure the organisations on this call, I don't think that the issues of sustainability, whether they're environmental or human sustainability, will go away. And I think there is, I think as Chris mentioned, a greater depth of purpose around us as leaders and our organisation. So I don't think that will wane, but it'll be interesting to see whether that is a collective of all organisations. Certainly, we see that government will make the certain changes in the way in which they buy, and I'm sure that the private sector would as well. So I think there will be a greater onus of responsibility in organisations to work with their communities, work with local suppliers, support their local NHS or their local schools, work with entrepreneurs, support training, development. And I think you've got a session later on about how we can support people as well. So I do think that will be an element of sustainability that we'll see come to the fore. But I wouldn't say it was a smooth path. I think it will be a bumpy ride as organisations have this balance between survival and then thriving in the future.
That's very good.
I think it would be wrong for us all to think that there's going to be some immediate hard exit out of this, that we're going to wake up one morning and then everything's going to be completely normal again. So whatever happens, the behaviours that have been created, forced upon us, however we see them over the last, God knows it, like nearly 7 months now, they are, for many people, that the process will have been long enough that they will have quite lasting impact on us as human beings. Therefore, even if things do change and we are allowed to change our behaviours, it will take time before we change our behaviours materially. So I can't see a material hard exit to the changes in behaviours. I think it has reminded people of this idea of survival of the fittest. There is a horrible side to COVID, which is it does kill vulnerable people. And I think that has reignited again a sense of care for each other, but also care for yourself, and people considering what they eat, what their stress levels are, what their blood pressure is. And I don't think that will go away. I think there'll be certain parts of society that will take it more seriously than others, but I think most people will see the importance of looking after themselves and others, because that's ultimately the thing that gets you through this. If we remove financial situations, the most important thing is that we have strong minds and strong bodies to be able to be resilient to the situation in which we find ourselves, but also then be able to cope physically through the situation in which we find ourselves. And so I think that will continue to keep going for some time. And I'm sure at some time we'll forget about it, as society does, and some businesses will then kind of run off and do new things. But I do think purpose, as we've spoken about before, and this idea of emotional connection, but also ethics, is incredibly prevalent. And I think whilst this has been very specific about COVID, it's not talking about things like Black Lives Matter and how many other concerns and imbalances have also been brought to life through this pandemic, where actually people are saying, well, don't just solve one thing, don't just solve this pandemic, actually deal with all of the wrongs that are existing in society, and businesses that don't take those things seriously and don't try to rebalance themselves, have greater purpose, take more conscience and consideration about the way they act, who they are, how they work across a multitude of different aspects. I can't see how they will survive for the long term. They might survive the short term, but I can't see how they'll be a positive contributor to themselves and to society for long term.
Mark, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of the things that Chris has said. I think what's also brought into sharp focus, taking the point I made earlier, is that there is a big proportion of society that just are struggling to get access to food. And obviously the Marcus Rashford campaign has really highlighted that as another one of the injustices in society that needs to be fixed, not necessarily directly connected to the pandemic, but certainly has come to the fore during the pandemic, that needs to be fixed. And yeah, I think that the education, we have all had a bit of time, more time than we were expecting at home, to reconnect with food through, eating together, cooking, growing. And it would be nice to see that continuing, because all of those things have good connectedness to well-being and understanding of where food comes from, and then ultimately sustainability. But I think the last thing for me is really this notion that food has the power to reconnect people. So as we are able to reconnect with the lives that we once lived, and do it in a better way, that food has a way of being that connector, whether that's as families, whether that's as schools, whether that's in the workplace, or for leisure, in us trying to make sure that our own personal well-being is heightened. Certainly, I think that food has a really important role to play, but we have to make sure that the food service we provide, I think, taking Chris's point, expectations have grown. So we have to make sure that whatever that offer is, that it's very relevant to the way in which people are feeling and thinking at the time. And it's elegant, which means that, yes, we will have to do things more simply, but that shouldn't compromise on quality, and that we have to make sure it's viable so that it's affordable for consumers, but it enables those that provide those services to survive themselves. So there's an awful lot of work to do, and I think we're just guiding ourselves into where we think the right purposeful path is for the future.
But that's also the opportunity as well, isn't it? Because hospitality can be the glue for communities as well, and play a really, probably a more important role socially than it has done before.
yeah, we would expect that food should play a bigger part in connecting communities together in the future, and do all of those other really good things that Chris mentioned about physical and mental well-being as well. So I think there's lots of reasons why food as a player, if you like, to rebuild society has a big role.
I agree. Chris, final words?
No, I think I agree with Mark, and kind of that sentiment of the importance of food and hospitality as a kind of facilitator for connection, for humanity, for kind of love and comfort, and all of those wonderful things that kind of bring us together. Therefore, it seems a real sad shame that hospitality is being attacked through this process, despite all of the investment that's gone in hospitality. And I think I would be an ambassador for kind of the continuation of the good work that many are doing in terms of lobbying this idea of stop using statistics to show one thing when statistics actually show something else. But that's a political standpoint. But hospitality is important. It's not just important because of the way that it brings people together and provides a facilitative environment and a safe environment to do that, but also in order to do that, it's got to have people that want to work in it. And it's been something that's been a challenge for hospitality to navigate for many years, about attracting the right talent and the right people. And I think hospitality was getting better at that. But in this time, many hospitality businesses are having to let people go. So I've heard many workers from hospitality say, well, that's it, I'm just going to choose another career because I can't see how hospitality is going to survive this. So I think there's a real danger at the moment for hospitality, therefore for consumers, if hospitality plays such a pivotal role. And then my final comment would be just to continue, if you want to have a successful business, to continue to build emotional connections with consumers and ensure that your business engages and looks at consumers and consumer behaviors rather than that of competition. So hotels historically, certainly for the time that I've been in hotels, spend a lot of time looking at what the competition does and then reflecting that in a bubble, rather than looking at what consumers are doing, how consumer behaviors are changing, which is where really you should be if you want to build emotional connections and experiences for consumers. So they would be my thoughts.
Good. Well, thank you both of you. I'm conscious of time, we've run out of time, but thank you for your contribution today. It's been great. I thought it was a fascinating discussion. So many thanks for that. And can I now bring back Karen, please? Thank you very much, Mark and Chris. Hi, Karen.
Unmuting. Thank you very much. That was a fascinating panel. There's some real gems that I think have been shared with us there. So I found that a very worthwhile discussion. We're now going to turn to our next panel session, which is called The Need to Be Inclusive. And I think the need to be inclusive is more important than ever in these times. And on my panel, Chris, you're going to stay and make a contribution to this panel, which is great. But I'd also like to welcome Alice Woodwark and Joanna Aunun. And do we have both Joanna and Alice on screen now? I'm going to introduce each of them briefly. Alice has been a managing director with the Restaurant Associate Group since 2019, although she has been with the Compass Group family since 2013. Her mission is to ensure that RA's customers are happy because they eat well and are being looked after. A real challenge for a contract catering business in these difficult times. Joanna started her career as a fast-track graduate at Hilton and has worked in talent management, in hospitality and other sectors. She's currently a director of Women in Hospitality, Tourism and Leisure, whose mission is to make a positive difference to 5 million women and also to people from ethnic minorities across the hospitality, tourism and leisure industry globally by 2025. If I could also mention a couple of my credentials in this space, a lot of you will know me as a a lawyer who practices in the hospitality sector, I've actually had a very strong interest in inclusion for many years now. About 5 years ago, I co-founded an organisation called Real Estate Balance, which aims to get and keep more women in senior positions across the real estate sector. We've had some considerable success with that organisation. We now have over 80 really great corporate members, including a number of the UK's biggest property companies. And I'm also very honoured to be on the advisory board of Women in Hotels, which is a fantastic, relatively new organisation that was launched earlier this year. So, Joanna and Alice, are you ready for some questions?
Absolutely.
Welcome. Thank you very much for joining today's panel. I'd like to start off really by asking you, what does inclusivity mean for you and your organisations? And perhaps if we could start with Alice there, please.
Yeah, so inclusivity is, I guess, maybe if I answer it personally first, inclusivity, I've started realising over time, is a much broader, bigger thing than I've thought about it maybe over the years of my career. So we start, I think it's easy to think about it in terms of thoughts about women in the workplace or people from different ethnic backgrounds in the workplace. But for me, and particularly maybe this is where, I don't want to bring it up again, but this whole COVID thing has actually had an impact, is there is a huge link between inclusivity and just thinking about belonging and working. You know, I help lead and support an organisation. So for me, working in a place where all the parts of someone are welcome and you can turn up to work being the person that you are, and you can feel like you are embraced for that. I mean, personally, work is a huge part of my life, not because it has to be, because I love it. I love coming to work and spending time with people at work. And to be able to do that in a place where I have opportunity and I feel like I belong in a place is, I just think, immensely important part of being a human. And the thought that some of the ways that we act or some of the structures we put up mean that people don't necessarily feel like they belong and don't feel like they have opportunity is a horrible, horrible thought. And it's not what I'm here to do. So for me, it's all about belonging and that broader sense of inclusivity. And it doesn't have to be about a particular thing about yourself. It could be about literacy or many things, or your family situation. But I think that sense of belonging is really important. And that translates directly through to, I guess, the organisational side, where we work in a hospitality industry that is fundamentally all about the way we make people feel. And so in my eyes, we have to start with ourselves. So I think it all really comes together.
Joanna, would you like to comment a little on women in hospitality, tourism and leisure, and what you've been doing since you joined and since it was launched?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've just celebrated our official second birthday, which is
congratulations.
Great, thank you. A little bit longer, but officially we're two. And I think, you know, as you mentioned, we focus on two key strands of what you would call diversity in terms of gender and race and ethnicity. But everything that we do helps companies come together to collaborate to make their environments more inclusive. So great practice that you do in one particular area will transcend great practice across all areas. And I think Alice made a fantastic point that it's so much wider and broader than just the words of diversity, which, let's be honest, is representation. And then it's about inclusion, about belonging. And now there is the concepts, particularly after the summer, particularly after COVID and Black Lives Matter, of equity and equality. And, you know, so, you know, all of these concepts wrap up together to say, do you have an environment where people feel they belong, that they can thrive and they can be themselves? And to kind of articulate that in a more practical way is, you know, how many people have to mask themselves to fit in your environment? And my background originally, well, through many different things, is talent acquisition, recruitment, talent development. And I heard several times when a candidate was regretted, they're not a cultural fit. And what does that mean? They're not a cultural fit. They won't fit in the culture. And I think, you know, I would encourage people to think about that, because we should be moving towards what's the cultural add. And, you know, are we inclusive, and are we maximizing the strengths and the approaches and the vibrancy that inclusion brings, which also leads quite honestly to the bottom line as well. So, you know, the business case has been, you know, poured through and put forward countless times through McKinsey reports, Hampton Alexander reports, and ultimately it's about productivity, belonging, thriving, and coming together to make a brilliant business.
I was talking yesterday actually to a new organisation that's being launched, BBI, the Black Business Institute, and I had a presentation from them, and they were saying, look, this makes business sense. Companies make more money if they pay attention to these things. And it took me back to when we started to talk about the women's agenda, about you've got to have women on board, you've got to have women in your organisations, because dear directors, this makes business sense. You make money from this. And I always think it's rather sad in a way that you have to effect change in a way, or get to the leadership by telling them they have to do this because it makes business sense. But I mean, if that's the way you have to start, so be it. But it is a truth that it does make business sense. But apart from that, being an inclusive organisation makes sense in all sorts of other ways.
And I think a very silly anecdote, but one of my favourite stories is of those of you who remember the Vauxhall Nova, the car. It wasn't doing very well in Spanish-speaking countries, and they wondered why. And if they had had someone a little bit more Spanish-speaking, they would have understood that Nova means it doesn't go. You know, it's about diversity of thought as well, diversity of experience, and particularly, are you mirroring your customer base? Are you mirroring the work where your sites are based? It's all of these things to say, you know, it goes much wider than, I think one of your speakers earlier said about statistics, you know, it goes much deeper and much wider.
But what would you rate as your sort of key successes at the organisation so far? I know you've got a fabulous mentoring scheme, and I've been a beneficiary of that. And I'm actually, through Women in Hotels, I mentor a young woman in the hospitality sector, but your organisation provided the training for that, which has been quite special.
I think our biggest success has been bringing together companies to collaborate really effectively and creating safe spaces for those companies, particularly over the last few weeks, whether it's been COVID or all the other events as well, Black Lives Matter, to create safe spaces to really come together, contribute, share, and move forward more quickly. So one of those examples is we've just a few weeks ago, we created a race and ethnicity committee in HTL. And we now have 25 companies from across the sector, and we represent airlines, hotels, restaurants, casinos, you know, are part of our collaboration platform. And you have different companies from McDonald's to Hilton to EasyJet really sharing and collaborating. And we've also, we now have over 20 companies from our platform that have signed the Race at Work Charter. And we've got 200 people on our mentoring programs. We've established a reverse mentoring. So I could go on and bore everybody for hours. But yes, the biggest, I think, achievement, and Compass as well is one of our key members. And we bring companies together. I think that's the biggest achievement.
A lot of this goes back to the whole topic of leadership that I'd like to bring Chris on in a minute. But first of all, Alice, could you perhaps tell us a little bit about what Compass has been, or what RA have been doing to embed inclusivity within the organisation?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a multi, I suppose it's a constant strand in our I suppose just our strategy for the business to have diversity and inclusion as one of the things that we focus on. So one of our three big pillars for right across Compass is obviously people, and within that, diversity and inclusion is always there. We do flex the areas of diversity and inclusion that we are exploring over time. So folks might be familiar with our Women in Food programme, which we launched a couple of years ago when we had a particular focus on gender, something that we were thinking a lot about. And this year, the focus is, I say shifting, it's sort of expanding to think more about backgrounds and ethnicity. And the goal in that is that as we explore these different areas, we increase our learning. We don't leave the programs behind. So Women in Food is still there, and all of the things that we set up when gender was our focus is still there. But the programmatic I suppose, structure allows us to take some deeper dives and be learning together as an organization. So I think that's been a very helpful thing for us, because it's kept the conversation very, very live and very fresh. And it's meant that we're all learning an awful lot as we go through month by month, year by year. If I talk a bit about specifically what have we been doing recently to get ourselves going forward on the inclusion agenda, there's 3 things that I've been involved in, and I've learned through my involvement in it how effective it is. And I should say I'm the D&I champion for Compass UK. So I have the privilege of sitting with our network groups and helping them think through how we progress this. But 3 things really stand out to me, and I would recommend this to absolutely everybody. The first is to listen, to really listen to people who are in your workspace and coming from a different perspective from yours. So we've set up a lot of just one-on-one listening conversations with people who come from a different background and will have different life experiences to share. I really think this is something where if we charge in with our own perspective and our own preconceptions, by definition, that's just the preconceptions of one person. And we're trying to improve things on an inclusion basis for the benefit of those who might not, almost by definition, might not necessarily come from the same place we are. So I found those listening conversations just hugely valuable, both hearing snippets from others and also doing them myself. And some things you wouldn't expect, like speaking to a female colleague who then shared that her partner comes from a different ethnic background, and that gives her a completely different view of how they are treated when they're out together and what challenges he faces versus what challenges she faces. I know her relatively well, but I had no idea that she carried this story with her. And to be honest, that context made so much sense. But to hear it was an eye-opener. So I think the first thing is listen, and listen one-on-one. Don't just read reports, go out and talk to people. The second thing is, I agree that statistics can be challenging, but I do think this is an area where data is really important, because it shows you where you actually are as opposed to where you think you are. And when we've looked at our data, what we found is that on a lot of metrics, we have relatively good representation when we look at sites where we operate. But if we look at our leadership levels, we don't. And we haven't found a great heart of darkness in terms of behaviors that we've uncovered that we're deeply unsettled by. However, we know that we're not doing everything right. We can't be, because the numbers just show us that the end result isn't there. So I do think understanding your data and getting comfortable with it is really critical. The third thing I would say is just start talking about it and make it part of your everyday conversation. We've heard so much, particularly through the listening conversations, people saying, I don't feel like I am actively discouraged at work, but I also don't feel very much like this is a topic that is important to the people around me and the people above me. So just making it part of what we say at the start of meetings, making it a casual thing. So one thing we did over the last few weeks, which I loved, was we started doing inclusivities with a TEA at the end. It's very hospitality. And all it means is it's just getting together. We've done a couple distanced face-to-face, and we've done some digitally. There's just basically a coffee morning, and it opens up a little bit of conversation around where we are on an inclusivity basis, but it also is just an opportunity to talk without talking shop. And those demonstrations of this being important, sometimes I think the smallest things are actually the most important things, because then you can lace it into what you're doing every day. So the things I've learned over the last year is listen to other people, do check out your data and be honest with yourself about it, and then get out there and change some small things that show that you care.
Really, really good. I think some real pearls there. And I think this all goes back to, again, the question of and the imperative that to be strong leadership in this topic, particularly at the moment. And again, a discussion I was having yesterday with some younger people was what you mustn't do, however, is have a leadership group made up of a lot of self-congratulatory people who've already made it and who don't listen, as you were saying, to people who are maybe at an earlier stage in their career, who are saying, well, you've done this, what's your relevance to me? You don't speak to me, you speak to each other and pat yourselves on the back and feed down policies and procedures that never actually reach me. I mean, Chris, I know this is something that you've been spending a lot of time on within EP, talking about leadership as a concept generally. There's some comments that you'd like to make on that from what?
Yeah, I think there's a number actually. Thank you, Karen. Data, I absolutely agree. I spoke to an author of a all parliamentary report yesterday, and actually I was quite shocked. There's very little data on BME entrepreneurs, businesses, what's actually the effect of COVID's had on them. We can give the overall picture, but we can't break it down. So there is a problem in understanding data. The other thing which struck me from the report was two things. One, we celebrate diversity and inclusion in the UK socially, and we actually enjoy it, but somehow it doesn't translate. And actually we've got to bridge that somehow. We've really got to start bridging it because there's a real lack of trust. It's a bit about lack of trust and confidence from people. They don't trust in the systems and the structures. And we've got to somehow start building that trust, because we've been talking about this now for 30 years, off and on in different ways. And have we really made the progress? Yeah, we are making progress, but it should be faster. And actually the real problem is structural. We need to start making sure that trust, and that does come from leadership as well. We do need leaders particularly getting involved. With inclusivity, I agree with you, it's very, very important. And actually the more we can actually start embracing and building trust, of giving confidence, particularly now to young people of all generations, we've got to start giving them the opportunity to come through. Because that's the only way we're going to get the economy kick-started, if the young really see opportunity and hope as well. So this is a really, really important time, I think.
And what we found in our studies and surveys that we conduct regularly through Real Estate Balance is that whereas a lot of our business leaders are saying the right things and doing the right things, and we've got young people who are expecting that this is the life they're going to be able to lead, middle management can often be a blocker. And we've been really finding it difficult to find ways in which we can smooth out the middle ground so that the young people are not blocked in their aspirations. And I think that's a really difficult one to crack. Well, yeah.
Just quickly on that one, do you know what the average age of an entrepreneur is now?
24? No, completely wrong.
48.
Oh dear.
And that's the point, is actually people, everything's become about risk now. So young people are patronized about not taking any risk and having that opportunity often, or everyone's patronized, not just a thing. But actually entrepreneurs are opting out at the end because actually they're losing trust and hope as well. So we need to give that hope back into all people's society.
I do think the situation that we're in, I think, is a very powerful one in our ability to help here, because on the one side, you've got some really big social issues and agenda items that are being raised in kind of a BBC kind of way. Like, the phrase white privilege, for example, I'm not sure people said it much 2 years ago, and now it's everywhere. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have people just trying to go about their daily lives and get that sense of fairness and belonging that we're all talking about. And I think companies, organizations, I guess, are in a brilliant place right in the middle of that, where we have the resources to think about and interpret those big issues, but we also have direct contact with people who we can directly help. So we're in a really nice kind of like middle-sized bit of this. And I think there is more that we can do to take on that role with a sense of responsibility. So something, for example, that we've started doing early stages is setting up the opportunity for education for people who may sit in that kind of middle layer of our organization, so that people have the space and the language to start talking about these things. I mean, I certainly feel, from the perspective of being a woman, I'm happy talking about that because I am one. And so therefore my chances of being challenged about getting it wrong are pretty low. But from an ethnic perspective, I'm very worried about my conversation being hurtful to someone or using the wrong word or the wrong phrase, and being incredibly aware that I don't have the perspective to know where I might hurt someone accidentally. And therefore it's super easy for me not necessarily to engage with those conversations because I don't want to get it wrong. And if the BBC kind of has all these big words flowing around, and I'm aware of there being a lot of pressure around these things, perhaps I will back off even more. But as a company, we have things like training and buzz sessions and ways of getting to people to help start these conversations and perhaps start a bit of, quite sensible level learning that would just allow people to connect. So I think actually being an organization, being a company in this space is a really powerful thing to be. And I think that's probably a positive for the future.
Yeah. I mean, through the organizations I've been involved in, I mean, because you can only take one bite at a time. We've always said we've really very much focused on gender diversity, but that really isn't enough anymore. I think as Joanna was saying, you know, ethnicity is a huge thing. So you can no longer look at a panel and say, that's great, I've got 5 women on that panel, that's fantastic, goodness me, there are no black people there. And we've now got to really think in all sorts of different ways about inclusivity in its very wider sense. And I think, Alice, you've hit on a real issue there in terms of the language that we use, even in terms of putting out surveys to get the data that you say you need, you know, that we all think we need. How do you phrase those questions? So we're actually going through training programs at the moment from people who are able to say, no, you shouldn't ask the question in that way, you should ask it in this way, and please don't ask this question, this is the right way to phrase it. So it, you know, that's again a great thing. But I wanted to just come back to Joanna there and ask, what do you see, Joanna, as the key challenges for the hospitality sector in particular in achieving more inclusivity across the board?
Well, I think, you know, sadly, we can't miss out COVID. I think that we've spoken obviously at length today about it. And I think that when many of our companies in our sector are talking about survival, you know, it's about where does the D&I, whether it's budgets, teams and focus. But, you know, and we conducted a piece of research with PwC and the MBS group around the impact of COVID on gender and ethnic diversity. And I would say from that research, 15% of the companies, there were 60 companies across the sector that were saying this, that D&I had remained top of mind, that was being spoken about at board level. And that leaves a lot of companies where it's not. So I think there is huge opportunity. Lots of your speakers have talked about building back better, you know, starting, you know, taking the opportunity that COVID has presented to really think about things differently. So yes, it is a challenge. And what we need to be careful of is that there are unforeseen consequences. So for example, very few businesses, most businesses have had to restructure in our sector over the last few weeks. Only 10% were looking at how that impacted their diversity. And back to your point, Chris, a lot of role models have been lost, and that impacts trust. So I would say that is a challenge of thinking the impact of the pandemic, but also what are the opportunities. And I think there is a talent drain from our industry into other sectors right now, particularly if you think about, there's been a disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women, and functionally marketing, digital, all of the areas that you would say is cross-industry. There is a real risk of a talent drain with our industry. And I think our biggest challenge when we get there, crossing everything, is how do we recover at pace? Because longer term and thinking about that, I think, how do we attract people back? How do we, you know, get to a point, because we will shoot through the roof when we can't emerge on the other side. And there is a lot of work I think businesses need to start thinking about now.
This is a point that Chris was making as well in the last session about hospitality. Hospitality has traditionally been for people, and it's all about people delivering a service. But now we hear more and more about, we're going to need more tech in this sector because of the COVID related regulations. You know, we've got to keep our distance. We need to have less personal contact with people rather than more. So I think that again exacerbates the issue, Joanna, there.
It does. And I think it's, but it's also a great time for innovative thinking and creativity. And I think that comes from diversity of thought and people. So it all, you know, the circle just is self-perpetuating. And I think it's so key, back to the point about data and feeling comfortable to be uncomfortable. That is a challenge. Leaders
are being happy to talk about it. You know, Alice was saying, have those conversations. Don't sit in a room where someone says something inappropriate and let it pass. You know, I myself have been in a room many times where you don't want to challenge the head of your group or whatever who makes an inappropriate comment, and you look around the table and think, well, why isn't anyone saying something? And I think we are now, especially those of us who are in more senior positions, we have a responsibility to keep that conversation going and to not let people think it's okay, because we let down younger people if we do that. We're all part of this change.
We did, and we did a really interesting session on courage, connection, and curiosity. And because it is courage, you do have to be courageous and open, but also educate yourself, because I think there's a piece about coming from the spectrum up to denial in any sense of diversity, up to being an ally in any sense of inclusion. So, and that takes courage and curiosity.
It does indeed. So we're nearly out of time. Can we have maybe just a final observation from each of you? Chris, in terms of the importance of inclusivity going forward, what is perhaps the single most important thing you think an organisation needs to do to embed that message?
Well, I think we need to build trust, and actually we need to make sure people feel confident that they're actually fair process, which actually we all believe, but actually we've got to actually make it happen. So it is about getting the structures right, because again, as all the research will show, the actual greater, more inclusive you are as a business, actually the more successful you'll be, the more profitable you'll be.
Indeed. Alice?
I think start with, from a personal perspective, just start with the things that we're able to control and change something now. So start bringing it into our conversation, yes, pick people up on things, but also just, make it a positive part of what we do. There are so many things that pass our desks, whether that's about people policy or hiring or the way that we operate, the way that we celebrate things together. And are we being inclusive in the way that we do those? If we can make some small changes, if you can look back over your week and say, yeah, there were 2 or 3 moments there where inclusion was part of how I thought about this business as usual thing, I think that's how we're going to make a lot of progress.
Yeah, and the whole celebrating things together in teams, such obvious things. We're not able to get our teams together. We've got Christmas parties coming up. People are thinking, oh, let's do a Zoom bake-off or a Zoom cocktail making session. All of these things require a little bit of thought about who you might exclude in the type of choices that you make with the kind of activities that you put on, for example. And finally, Joanna, what would you like to say to finish?
I would say, coming to Alice's point as well about ACT. So every company is in their own part of their journey, and you have to understand where you are in that journey. But I think it's no longer possible for businesses not to do anything. No. So I think is to act and to use platforms, particularly senior leaders, whether it's internally or externally, use your platform and your influence and your sphere of influence to start making a change.
Thank you very much. So I think we need to wrap up there. Thank you so much to Alice and to Joanna for those very, very interesting and pertinent observations. And thank you to Chris for joining us. And we're all looking forward now to our final session of the day.
So Nick, thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Karen. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joanna. Hi, Nick. Lovely to see you.
Kia ora, Chris. Thank you for inviting me along.
No, it's a pleasure, because I think, look, I've been looking forward to this session because I do think New Zealand has obviously become one of the role model countries almost in the world, increasing your expectations on what you have to do. But it's been quite a journey, hasn't it? No pressure, by the way, but it has been quite a journey for New Zealand to get to this point of stature. Is that fair?
Yes, definitely.
Because actually you started from quite a low base where you had to create that change. Do you want to talk us through that a bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, far and away, actually, the biggest challenge that New Zealand faced, and if you look at it from a trading and a global perspective, was when the UK joined the EU in 1973, and trade barriers with New Zealand were erected as a result. And the UK was the traditional trading partner for New Zealand. And successive New Zealand governments adopted policies that paid subsidies and supported prices for farmers and other industries. And those subsidies weren't market related. And what that did was distort farming. And New Zealand was overproducing, or at a time producing poor quality that wasn't needed by international markets. And that situation was ignored for many years for political expediency. But in New Zealand, 1984 to 1990 was marked by ambitious and far-reaching economic reforms. I mean, at the forefront of those reforms was agriculture, and so it was New Zealand's largest export earner. And following the 1984 election, almost overnight, farming subsidies were abolished. Farmers learned to either thrive or fail. It was a time of great upheaval, those reforms in New Zealand. It was difficult for the farmers, but really what it did was meant that they had to become market-led, technology adopting, bring in genetic advancements, and generally look at every part of the industry. And today it's unrecognisable from 1984. It was a story that happened in other sectors of the New Zealand economy as well, but it wasn't without its pain. And really what New Zealand was forced to do at the same time was become innovative, but also look outwards. And what we did as a result was New Zealand was the first developed nation to sign a free trade agreement with China, which came into force in October 2008. And now China is New Zealand's largest trading partner. And since then, we've had a number of free trade agreements, which is relevant to the UK at this time, with Asia, and more recently into the CPTPP, which is the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which covers 14% of the world's GDP. So what helped is sort of as well in that intervening period between 2000 and 2018 is sort of been a near tripling in global trade, and as supply chains have developed, technology has advanced, and slowly trade barriers have come down. But the challenge now for New Zealand is and has been since our last Labour government came in, and which was re-elected on the weekend, has been how do all New Zealanders benefit from that success? There's a sense that only a few have, and how do we thrive in such a way that we can leave the environment in a better shape for the next generation?
I mean, that's the key, isn't it? Because you are seen as that leader in sustainability, as well as actually being a good role model for what we're going through now in Brexit. And that's the point, in sustainability, actually people do look to you for lead.
Yeah, there's a challenge there too. It's undeniable that New Zealand is a long way from Europe, the UK, and actually many global markets for that matter. And in some ways that actually that distance defines who we are. So it contributes to sort of a pioneering and resourceful character. And while the distance, and one of the challenges we face is that distance is apparent to consumers and easily equitable to things like carbon miles, but it doesn't really tell the full story. So if you look at things like red meat as an example in New Zealand, the beef and lamb sector has an encouraging greenhouse gas emissions profile. So the emissions have been reducing each year, and as at 2015, greenhouse gas emissions from red meat were 19% lower than the baseline of 1990. And so what we see is that lamb in the UK, for example, produces less greenhouse gas than lamb produced in EU countries, but more in New Zealand, more than New Zealand. And for New Zealand, a part of that is the need to be able to respond to what's required in international markets, but also that competitive edge that needs to have, because we're open to trade and open to all of those aspects of consumer demand. So to give you an example, that there's been just decreasing sheep numbers in New Zealand, almost halved the numbers since the 1980s, or more than halved, but production's remained the same. So the real emphasis on technology, production, and efficiency to try and improve that. And actually, a study by New Zealand University measured carbon emissions for lamb, dairy, and apples in New Zealand, and then sending them on to the UK. And the study found that because New Zealand farmers use less feed and fertilizer and more renewable energy, the product's actually less carbon intensive, even when shipped to the UK. But that's a difficult message to get through to consumers because of the obvious distance. And the same thing applies for how New Zealand operates with things like Sauvignon Blanc wine, that type of thing.
I mean, that's it. I mean, it's interesting because actually it seems to also the success you've made has had kind of an effect on the psychology of the nation as well, because it seems to be much more confident in some ways. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And I think that sort of opening up to the world early on at that time and going through some of that pain has meant that New Zealand has had to draw upon that trait of being resourceful and how that's brought about by the distance that we have from the rest of the world, to actually think about how we reinvent ourselves to improve our prospects, because we're not going to get rich trading with ourselves. We're not going to have a thriving economy and good social standard.
No, I get it. I want to touch on the well-being budget, which actually is quite a fascinating thing, because in the government has a well-being budget. Can you tell us a bit about that and how that actually does have impact?
Yeah, sure. So New Zealand brought in a well-being budget in 2019, and it's the first of its kind globally. And the budget looked at government spending to improve citizens' lives and their health and satisfaction in general, not solely around the metric of GDP. And that's because, as I talked about earlier, there's a sense that growth had left behind parts of society, and GDP increases didn't guarantee improvement into the living standards of all people. So the budget focused on spending in 5 areas, and good timing for we were going globally, but improving mental health outcomes, reducing child poverty, supporting Indigenous peoples, moving to a low carbon emissions economy, and flourishing in a digital age. And what that's meant in terms of trade has been the introduction of a trade for all policy. And that's quite relevant at the moment as New Zealand is engaged in talks with the UK around a free trade agreement. And this is where trade policy supports the likes of environmental issues such as climate change, labour rights, gender equality, the rights of Indigenous people, and people's health and well-being, as well as a whole range of metrics. So it's not just looking at the benefits of lowering tariffs and non-trade barriers, but a whole package of goods. And as I mentioned, that's what New Zealand is right now bringing to the second round of negotiations with the UK.
I was going to say, because obviously the Brexit thing, actually there's a lot we can learn from you at this point, isn't there? From your story of the last 30 years, I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to compare situations. New Zealand was a far smaller economy at a different time globally from where trade is at now. And the UK has some very established industries. So I think it's difficult to draw the comparison, but I'm sure there are some lessons to be learned.
I suppose what I'm trying to say is often the UK it's always down. It does itself down when you read the commentary. We're still obviously a powerful country, but actually you can feel sometimes the tensions, the lack of confidence in ourselves, which I think sometimes is what we've got to bridge with sustainability. Going back onto the COVID, because COVID's obviously and is continuing to be a major problem. How's it impacted on the plans of the government and on New Zealand?
Well, it's just to touch on where New Zealand's at. That New Zealand's have been very fortunate. We've had fewer than 2,000 cases of COVID and 25 deaths. And New Zealand has clearly done well at pursuing the strategy that they have, and are living under lighter restrictions at the moment. And evidenced by a full stadium to watch the All Blacks play on the weekend, which is quite a novelty in this day and age. I think that geographically speaking, as I said before, New Zealand's something of an outlier. So again, it's literally an outlier. So it's difficult to compare with other nations. But the positive fact when it comes to COVID, and historically, that we've had that need to be resourceful to survive. So I think that that, and what you were mentioning before about talking yourselves down, I think it's the harshest critics are always those people inside of a country when you start talking outside about it, which is a positive thing because it helps keep you in check. But I think it's really important to also look back and look at what those positives are. And I think the UK has a tremendous number to fall back on as well.
But there's probably things we need to do now to actually try to develop our message to the global market, because the world's changing at speed, isn't it, Nick? And that's part of where New Zealand scored, is sustainability now is crucial to younger people, and actually how it builds the confidence is becoming a thing. How we act with our international partners is also becoming a key piece as well, isn't it? And that's the bits you've already put in place that we can probably look at.
Yeah, and I think that there's a real opportunity for the UK to be a global leader in this space, and it's really encouraging to see what is being talked about in terms of trade as well from the UK. I mean, the UK has brought in the Britain is Great campaign, which is globally seen as a very successful nation branding campaign. And I think it has been successful because you have a wealth of heritage, culture, and innovation to draw upon, and the campaign's done well to highlight those things. And the UK has been remarkable at adapting to difficulties and thoughtfully reinventing itself to remain competitive globally. And I don't see that ethos waning anytime soon. And the strength of brand, national character, and government intent to build this independent trading policy that you have are all things that I think can be drawn upon.
No, look, I think that's absolutely true. In terms of the relationship you would like to see, because obviously you're a trade commissioner to the UK, what do you hope to see out of this period, the relationship between New Zealand and GB, and how we can actually work together?
I think there's a real opportunity to partner a lot more. And what I mean by that is not just around the sale of goods between the two nations. I think there is a huge opportunity for, if we look at something like technology, or areas like technology, agriculture, health, for shared services and understanding. The UK has tremendous educational institutions, very strong institutions inside the country. And, you know, I think that a lot to offer globally. And I think when I think about New Zealand companies coming here to establish themselves and vice versa, there is a lot that can be done between government, research, and private industry. And I'd love to see a lot more partnership between all of those, but within in the various nations. And I think that you know, trade in that sense is where it's heading. Services trade has increased enormously over the last few years. And it's actually a very good way of bridging a lot of cultural divides and those types of things. But, you know, I'm very positive about what can be achieved. And I'd love to see that integration be a lot stronger.
So what, in terms of the New Zealand brand, what are your challenges you see you're facing at this point in time?
Well, I mean, possibly the biggest challenge we have obviously is with, well, one I mentioned earlier was around the distance, the tyranny of distance, which is, when you look at that, a positive and a negative for New Zealand. The other side is that we have effectively had to close ourselves off from the world as a result of COVID. So to enter New Zealand, you have to first be a New Zealand citizen, and then you have to remain in a managed isolation quarantine facility for 2 weeks before you're released into the community, as it were. And what that means is it's very difficult for New Zealand businesses or educationalists or those types of things to travel abroad and bring new ideas back. And missing some of that people-to-people connection. So part of what the role that I'm working on is how do we improve that virtually, globally, between New Zealand and New Zealand businesses and businesses offshore. But there is a real challenge to that. And then there are other challenges that we have to deal with in terms of the environment and those aspects where, yes, we're seen to do well in some areas, but there are definitely areas for improvement as well. You have to be able to back up your claims with the reality of what you're achieving.
And what's your hope after all this? Because I mean, we all talk about, and every time we pick up the press, we hear about the threats. But actually, for every threat, there's an opportunity as well, isn't there, as you've been pointing out? And actually, over here, I think there'll be a real surge of entrepreneurs coming through from this, and actually new ideas will emerge through. And actually, it may well be a catalyst for a real change coming through. Are you seeing the same kind of energy potentially coming out of New Zealand?
I think so. I mean, well, absolutely. The jolt in the way that we're living has completely shifted people's views on the world. And actually, I saw a report this morning from, I think it was from the Royal Mail, that was talking about you know, a huge number of increase in the UK of I think it was 16,000 online businesses that have sprung up in the last few months, and the demand that's created for them. So I think this type of thing is undoubtedly going to do that. I think it's a reset, as some of your panelists have mentioned earlier, in terms of what goes on with the environment. and how we approach that. And I think there's a reset in terms of people, particularly what I'm noticing is people talking a lot more about issues like mental health, because it's come to the fore as we all live in a slightly more disconnected world. But my hope is that that these things, we take the positive from it, we push it. It's very easy to catastrophize, but we push it into the right direction. And so my hope for New Zealand and for the UK is that we have a thriving economy and society that isn't at the expense of our environment, and that my children get to grow up in New Zealand that I would be as proud to live in now, so that they continue that pride through. And I think that the UK similarly, I think as I mentioned earlier, is a prime position to take a leadership role globally in this. And if the quality of the panelists you've had on today is anything to go by in the comments that they're talking about, I think you're in good hands.
Oh, look, someone said to me yesterday in a comment that most leaders have probably had 15 years of training in 6 months. Just by the amount of new strategy plans they've had to probably develop in the last 6 months. And I think there's an element of truth, but actually one of the greatest periods we saw was after the Second World War, when people came back from the army and that experience with greater skills, and which actually then benefited business and benefited society. And we may well see a similar type thing. Thinking's changed.
I think we'd be well prepared for the next crisis when it comes along as well.
But hopefully it won't be quite like this one, I hope, to be fair, as much as anything else. In terms of New Zealand produce, it's been a long trading history, hasn't it, between the two countries, and actually New Zealand products have long done well here. Do you see not just that continuing, but actually is there a greater buy-in to New Zealand products as well because of your stature in the world?
Look, I really hope so. I think that also within the UK and what we're seeing globally is a desire for many consumers to want to go local as well. And the reality is that the UK only produces just over 50% of the food it can eat, or that it does eat. And so there is a need to have these global supply chains in place and the security in place. And I do hope that New Zealand has done very well, as I mentioned, with the COVID situation, and that translates into sort of brand push for the country.
But that's one of the challenges for you, isn't it? Is that battle between localism that's coming to the fore and the fact you are so far away, and how even though there's a great affection, it's how we get that balance right, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that kind of comes back to what I was talking about earlier, that it's very easy to think that distance translates into high carbon when actually the reality is different. And that's a message that sort of I'm tasked with supporting over here, and New Zealand businesses have bought into and are working hard on.
Oh, look, Nick, thank you so much for your time today. It's been much appreciated talking to you.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a real pleasure.
And all the best. Thank you. Can I bring Karen back on now? Just do a short summary at the end. Hi.
Hi, I'm here. I hope. If I stop my video again, yes, here I am.
Yeah, all good. As we've got a few more minutes, just what are your thoughts on today?
Well, I think we've had a fascinating variety of panelists and views expressed. And when you and I first started to talk about putting this seminar together, Chris, we talk about one of the key points was what is sustainability? And I think what has been brought to the fore for me today is that how wide an embrace it has, particularly in the life that we're now living, and how it's not just, I think a lot of people don't actually know what it means. And I hope that we've been able to give people a little bit of a steer today, that it covers social, cultural, environmental issues, a whole span of things that's of critical business importance to us all as we move forward.
Oh, I think that's right. And I think actually hospitality has a really great role to play in that.
Yes, indeed.
And actually out of all this, out of the hardships it's all facing, actually it's good things can come.
Yeah, and UFI's Energy Alliance is a fantastic thing, I think, for the hospitality sector, and one that will give it a real focus, I think, and a real steer for businesses as to what they can be doing to improve their position in relation to climate change and energy consumption. Because it just doesn't seem right that the hospitality industry is lagging behind others in terms of the energy that it uses. And it's a real time for us all to start to take the lead here, I think, and turn things around.
Well, I think that's right. I think
customers will expect, Chris, isn't it? That's what the customers of our businesses will expect.
Well, and investors too. Investors will expect us to be right on top in market leading all these areas as well.
That's right, yes.
So I suppose to do. And I thought David, Ellen and David were very fascinating talking about the environmental piece, sustainability.
Yes, indeed. And I've written down Alice Woodwark's 3 pearls of wisdom, which I think are particularly interesting in terms of that, having that dialogue in relation to inclusivity within your own business. Listen to people, listen to the younger people in the organization. You can't always be a role model for people at a different stage in their career, but make sure that you involve them in the discussions. Don't just set up talking shops of people who've already made it, people who are senior leaders. Involve people at all levels of your organization in the dialogue.
And I thought Chris and Mark were fascinating, talking about how they're seeing behaviours change and some of those challenges as well, because it will be interesting how that happens. And Nick in New Zealand, actually, I expect New Zealand will give us some good guidance to how we can actually cope with Brexit and how we cope afterwards as well.
Well, I think this is, for us, certainly, this is, Chris, this is hopefully the first of several dialogues that we can have with stakeholders about the whole topic of sustainability. We're shortly going to be launching a client survey amongst our own clients and contacts to see what sustainability means to them. So hopefully we can report back a little on that on the next of these sessions that we do. And picking up again on your running theme of leadership, this never a more important time for leaders of businesses to really show leadership in terms of being inclusive with their people, looking to the future, and making their businesses future-proof in sustainability terms.
Well, I think leaders would change, would come out of this very different. I think it's been a heartbreaking time for them, and I think it has been a really tough 7 months. And actually, a lot of their views will change as we come out, and actually, that experience is going to be invaluable coming out. Actually, I'm very positive about 2021, despite all the problems of this moment in time. Well, thank you. Our thanks to everybody. It's been a great session. I've heard some great content there. And thanks for Lauren to organising us behind the scenes, and to James for helping us today as well. And to Karen, our thanks to Bird and Bird for always being a great partner to us.
Thanks also to you, Chris, at EP. And I think we are going to be sharing a video link.
We will do. We'll have all this produced this afternoon, and everything will be shared out and circulated again as well, a bit later on and tomorrow.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks to all our panelists. And
thank you to everybody. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
For dialing in to listen.